Senator Gregg of New Hampshire. You heard from him at the top of this hour in the CNN newsroom, is a member of the President's National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. He joins us from Capitol Hill. Senator, good to see you. And CNNMoney.com's senior writer, Jean Sahadi, has been covering the Debt Commission extensively. Senator Jean and I are both going to fire some questions at you, if you don't mind. Let me get started first. So the goal is $3.8 trillion, $4 trillion in cuts over and revenue enhancers over the next 9 years. Let's call it 10 years. You're going to sign off on this plan. Senator Conrad is signing off on it as well. Tell me why you are supporting these recommendations.
Well, because we're on a path to fiscal disaster. And the simple fact is that under our present fiscal policies, this country's debt is going to go to a level that's unsustainable. And we're going to fundamentally undermine the prosperity of our children and reduce our security as a nation as our country moves towards some level of insolvency. We don't know what it'll be, but that's what we're headed towards. So action has to be taken. Now, this plan isn't perfect, and no plan would be perfect in my mind. If it were perfect, it wouldn't get that many votes other than my own. But as a very practical matter, it is and it's not global either. It doesn't address all the problems. But it does make a very significant statement that we as a nation can get our fiscal house in order, and we're going to start. And it says to the American people that if we pass this plan, we will govern in a way that is responsible. And it says to the world that we are willing to take on what is a very big issue, not only for us as a nation, but for the world, which is the impending insolvency of our country if we don't act.
Okay, that is what you believe. Jean, one more from me, and then I'll turn it over to you.
No, that's not what I believe. That's the facts.
Okay.
Excuse me, just a second. That's not what I believe. That is the absolute facts. This country is on a totally unsustainable fiscal course. Everybody admits to that. And the issue is whether or not we're going to address it in an orderly way through governing, or whether we're going to have a massive, as I think it was Dave Cody said, the herd runs against us and fear takes over the market.
Okay. Here's the point I'm driving at. You've got members, your colleagues in the House and Senate on both sides of the aisle here who will absolutely agree with you on the need to move forward and do something here, but will disagree on revenue enhancers and on cuts. Are you absolutely convinced that all of the areas, even areas where you may disagree with the recommendations, that there has to be some kind of work in those areas in terms of reducing spending? Even in areas where you disagree with what is being proposed, yes, even in those areas, something has to be done.
Well, we're in a situation where doing nothing leads to disaster. Something has to be done. People have to start to govern and to stop shouting.
Okay. Jean, let me turn it over to you, and then I've got a couple of more for Senator Gregg.
Senator, I wanted to know, you made some very eloquent comments at the beginning of the meeting this morning about, you were trying to convince your fellow Republicans that this is a plan they ought to sign on to, even though there are many things they don't like about them, about the measures, in particular about the extra tax revenue that's raised and the concern that it won't be spent properly. Do you think that that message will get across not only to your fellow Republicans on the commission, but also in the Senate?
Well, I think first off on the tax policy, this is conservative tax policy in this bill, which is that basically you eliminate deductions and exemptions and you radically reduce rates on both individuals and business, and thus people start to invest money not for the purposes of avoiding taxes, but in order to get the best return, which inevitably leads to huge prosperity and economic growth. This is classic Reagan tax policy, and it was what we did in '86. This is, as I said, this is Reagan-Bradley on steroids. I think most of my Republican colleagues' reservations go to the omissions in the plan, which is basically that health care is not aggressively addressed, and health care is a big driver, probably the primary driver of our problem as a nation as the baby boom generation retires. And they think there should have been a revisiting of the whole health care issue, and that's been their basic concern.
On the issue of spurring economic activity, Jan Schakowsky, the House Democrat who sits on the commission, was also equally eloquent about describing why she won't be voting for the plan, because she doesn't think that there is enough attention paid to the issues of fairness and inequality of income and trying to rectify that situation. Because to her, she said, spurring economic activity is based on demand, putting money in people's pockets. And she has a hard time supporting this plan because it doesn't do that. For her, it's not so much about lower rates. How do you broker the divide between your positions?
We don't. You know, the Congresswoman has a very different view of what our problems are and how we should fix them. But this proposal, as it came forward, which I'm supporting, is bipartisan. In fact, it's basically nonpartisan. It is going to have a fair number of people who were appointed by the president and a fair number of Republicans supporting it. And it's got myself and Senator Conrad, who originally came up with the idea of putting together this type of an approach, supporting it. So I would, you know, I respect the Congresswoman's views, but the simple fact is that they aren't going to solve our problems because they're not politically going to get a consensus position or a bipartisan position. And you cannot move down the roads on these big issues like Medicare, like Social Security, like tax reform, unless you do it in a bipartisan way. First, because you can't get the votes, and secondly, because, quite honestly, the American people will not accept a partisan action in these areas, as has been shown by the health bill, which was run through this House and the Senate, run through the Senate and the House on a partisan basis, and has been so fundamentally rejected, I think, by the American population.
Okay, and Senator Gregg, one more from me. Tax policy, obviously one of the biggest factors in balancing this budget moving forward and reducing the deficit. We have a moment now, right now, where we can talk about tax policy, and you get a vote in this. What should Congress do regarding the Bush-era tax cuts? Isn't this a moment in this lame duck session where the chambers could make a real statement about debt reduction? And in this case, maybe it is what the House is working on, I'll get your view of it, allowing the tax cuts to expire for the wealthiest in the country.
No, that would be a very serious error. Think of this as a two-step dance. There's the short-term issue of how we keep this economy going, and the recovery is, to say the least, fragile, and for many Americans, it's non-existent still. A tax increase of any nature in this atmosphere would be extremely counterproductive and would probably throw us back into a very slow economy and maybe even in a recession. The issue we're dealing with on this commission is not the short term, how do we get out of this economic downturn? It is the long term of 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, making it clear that we're going to pass on to our children a nation which is as prosperous as we have today or more prosperous and equally secure. On our present path, that's not going to happen. We're going to pass on to our children a nation which is significantly less prosperous and therefore less secure. And they will have a lower standard of living because we are adding all this deficit and debt in the out years. We have to control those out years, and that's a separate set of policies from the short-term issue of keeping this economic recovery going, which requires that we not raise taxes now. Absolutely requires that.
Okay, Senator Gregg, we appreciate it. Yeah, I understand. The question might be when? When is the right time to address this? We're looking at third quarter GDP.
The Commission has laid out a very clear blueprint to do that.
Okay,
the Commission laid out a very clear blueprint on how to do that.
Thank you for your time. We appreciate it. And Jean Sahadi of CNNMoney.com, one of our senior writers there. Jean, appreciate it. Thank you. Let's get